G'day Year 11, welcome back to another lesson. Today what we're going to look at is lesson numero dos, or number 2, and it's looking at evolutionary and transformative change. So these are two really key concepts in this course, especially for this topic. These two concepts are without a doubt referenced in every single HSC paper I've seen since the new syllabus. There is always some multiple choice question on it. I've seen a couple of short answers using these concepts too, and it's some kind of language that you will definitely use when you are describing social theories of change, which we'll get to a little bit later because they're categorized as either evolutionary or transformative change. So two really big important course concepts we're going to go over today. It's on page 7. Make sure you highlight and date it, and we'll get started. So our dot points today are the nature of continuity and change, continuing on with that overarching dot point, and our two sub-points we're going to look at today is evolutionary and transformative change. So there are two main categories of change according to the society and culture syllabus, and I would like you guys to record these on your concept cards, please. So the first concept card, or the concept we're going to look at, is evolutionary change. So this is change that happens over a long period of time, and it's something that alters society on a large scale. So they're incremental changes, one by one, that accumulate over a long period of time. The sort of imagery you want to get into your head there is similar to the word evolution, the idea of ape to man. It took a very long time, and so when we're talking about social changes that happen over, 30, 40, 50 years, we refer to that as evolutionary change. It's something that's happened over a long time. So for example, evolutionary change, an example you could look at is when you're looking at it as a whole, the evolution of women's rights increasing over time. Okay, the sort of first suffragette movements around the 50s and 60s, and those fights for equality and feminism are still happening today. So that's something that's evolutionary change. When we're looking at transformative change, we're looking at something that's dramatic and rapid, and the change that occurs over a shorter period of time. So these are usually due to technology changes, social movements, rebellions, or revolutions. So for example, the most perfect example of transformative change we have is the COVID-19 pandemic and how the world has responded to it. That's a brilliant example of transformative change. Other ones are things like the Russian Revolution or French revolutions. You have rebellions in certain countries that have happened here or there where people take up arms and fight the government. And then you have various social movements that can happen rapidly. So for example, the Me Too movement was a rapid social movement that created transformative change at a macro level for women. So put both of those on different concept cards. So we've got evolutionary change as one, transformative change as another card. We're going to start looking at evolutionary change briefly here. So the society and culture syllabus gives it quite a long definition. I've given you my own version here, which is a little bit shorter, but they say it's a process of structural change. So when you see something that is structural change, we're looking at structures within society, okay, at a micro, meso, and macro level, but more typically at a meso and macro level when we're looking at structural change. So it's a slow alteration in the institutions. So the institutions or social institutions being things like government, education, for example, or social roles of society that are then integrated into society. So as I mentioned before, the social roles that women are playing have diversified over the last 50, 60 years due to evolutionary change and the value of women. So like all social change, it can occur as a result of internal sources. So it can either be an ideological or cultural shift, for example, women's rights movements, or technological innovation or other external resources such as environmental conditions, acculturation, or cultural diffusion. So when we're looking at external sources, we're looking at things that are happening outside of those immediate social institutions. Looking at something like environmental conditions being the external sources, acculturation or cultural diffusion. A great example there would be the multicultural nature of Australia changing over time. So the fact that we, upon invasion, were a majority white Anglo-Saxon culture, and we still are, but that is slowly changing over time, where we've got upwards of 20% of people in the population with parents born overseas. So that's an example of evolutionary change that's happened over a large period of time, or a long period of time. So the change with evolutionary change usually starts from a micro to meso to macro level, or it goes from a macro to meso to micro level with evolutionary change. The reason it goes that way is because what we describe as linear change, I know last lesson we looked at that word linear and non-linear there. So when we're looking at evolutionary change, it's a linear. It goes from point A to point B. You can sort of see here, there's nothing, I guess, that's disrupting the change and making it what we call dialectical, but we'll look at that later. But it's linear. It's very straightforward change with evolutionary change. So Westernization is a really big, probably one of the most prominent examples of evolutionary change. You can see the effect that the process of Westernization has had in the globalized context across many cultures and societies in the world. So evolutionary change sees it as a process, and it's not about a single event, whereas transformative change rarely focuses on a process, and it's more on a single event. So you can see they're sort of very opposites here. It gets its name due to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea that change is small and gradually occurs over time. So I'd highlight that. That's definitely this second dot point here and this last bit here. So the idea is that change is slow. Examples that we can have is the idea of environmentalism. So people advocating for the protection and preservation of the environment is a social movement that has gained traction very, very, very slowly over time. Sort of started around the post-World War II. It was the first kind of concepts of environmentalism once those nuclear bombs had dropped. Bureaucratization. So this is the idea that as society grows more complex slowly over time, the government and administrative organisations has to grow with it to meet the demands of the really big population. So as societies get bigger, they get a lot more complex. You need more rules, you need more policies, you need different hierarchies of power and authority to manage that as well. But obviously that's something that happens slowly over time. It's not like you go from 10 million people to 20 million people overnight, or within a year even. That is change that happens over time. And there's also demographic change. So any sort of changes that we're looking at our demographics, so things like the number of schools that might increase in Australia, our life expectancy slowly increasing is an example of evolutionary change, which is reflecting our medical system, but also our cultural system in the ways that we live more sedentary lives with less risk these days than we used to. So that is, in a nutshell, evolutionary change. The main things you want to get from it is that it's change that happens over a long period of time. It's a slow process, it's a gradual process, and it's definitely not a single event. It's definitely not something that happens quickly. And it's a linear change. It goes from point A to point B. Transformative change, however, is a little bit different. So transformative change is almost something, so when we look at evolutionary change, it's something that slowly moves from the micro, meso, macro, or macro, meso, micro, whereas transformative change is happening at all three levels concurrently. Because it's so rapid and it happens so quickly, there are a lot of different factors which contribute to it, I guess, kind of exploding is a way to look at it. Most times transformative change happens is when people oppose the current status quo and they confront social norms. So they're usually not, and that's in the case of, say, a lot of the revolutions we've seen across the world. The Russian Revolution is probably one of the most famous ones there. But the idea with transformative change, and I would highlight this, is it significantly alters social structures and abruptly shifts people's values and actions. So think of the idea of it being revolutionary. This really follows, this is really important because it follows into my next point. A social movement is not a viral YouTube video or an internet sensation. So if It is not transformative change if the latest TikTok dance video comes out and everyone starts doing it for a week. They haven't suddenly transformed society in some big and meaningful way. To be classed as transformative change, it has to significantly alter the social structure of it. So for example, in the Russian Revolution, they completely flipped. They got rid of the monarchy. They changed the entire legal system of the country and how it operates. Okay, that's a really big alteration of a social structure, for example. So it has to be quite significant. Almost has to have, you would say, a macro level impact, which would then filter out to the meso and micro levels. And the other main point with transformative change is that the effects are profound and have a permanent impact on society. So whether or not that impact lasts or not is sort of irrelevant to that point, in the fact that once it's happened, people aren't going to forget it anytime soon. It's part of history. So when we look at things like social political revolutions, when we look at women's rights over time, we would say that's evolutionary. But when we're looking at it in the way of movements such as the Me Too movement with feminism, is more what I'm referring to there, which we can probably write down. The civil rights movement in America and indeed Australia happened over a couple of years in the peak moments where there were protests and significant change happened. Similar with the gay rights, and in Australia particularly, the plebiscite was seen as transformative change, because that really got momentum over a couple of years, 2015, 2016, and then it became a reality. And again, significantly altered the social structure of society. Okay, changed a lot of laws. When we're looking at transformative change, though, most of them are in this idea of revolution. And when we look at Saudi Arabia, there's going to be two main points of transformative social change we'll look at, one being 9/11 and the other being Mecca. However, to really understand this, is a really great video on how to start a social movement by this dancing guy. So I want you guys to watch that and then tell me who the most important figure is when starting a social movement and why. A really great video. I know you'll love it. I'll put that link in the post for us to watch. Some examples of transformative change are things like social or political revolutions, like we've looked at. I think I talked about that a little bit. Feminism, we talked about that a little bit. Civil rights movement, I think I mentioned all of those. But there's some concrete examples that you can look at to get your head around the idea of what transformative change is. In a nutshell, and to summarize, it's something that happens at a micro, meso, and macro level concurrently. The significant change which occurs has to be very abrupt, and it has to be very profound, and it has to significantly alter the social structure of society. It's not a trend or a fad. It has to be really big, deep social change for it to be considered transformative change. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video.